Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this seminar, national seminar on Kautliya, and I extend my thanks to Colonel Gautam for inviting me to participate. The paper I'm presenting is titled "The Text as Tradition: Interpreting India's Strategic History." And what I'm just quickly going to lay out my presentation format before I begin. So I intend to theorize the Arthasastra, not its contents or the postulates, but approach it as a text. And try and locate the text within theory, particularly IR theory that the session deals with. So in the first section, I would contextualize or locate it within the notion of tradition. Tradition, which is basically an analytical construct that is connecting the past to the present, and hence the whole language that we hear about relevance of a certain text comes in. In the second section, then, I will pull together two distinct strands of scholarship. One, which is the colonial inquiries into ancient period, ancient Indian history, and also the existing contemporary scholarship on strategic culture, both of which accord primacy to the ancient period and try and draw parallels in terms of lessons we can draw in the contemporary era that we live in. And thirdly, I'll make a case for historical contingency to try and locate concepts and texts within the societal context they were written in, rather than trying to draw trans-historical interpretations that we often are tempted to. Um, as far as tradition is concerned, it's a notion that we intuitively feel we have a sense of understanding what it actually stands for. But within discourses, it's basically aims at, it's an analytical construct which involves a retrospective positioning of thinkers. It tries to draw a certain sense of direction through, or a certain path or a trajectory that a concept like power or state that we talk about, how did it evolve? What was the path of the teleological path that it took? But in doing so, very often we take back, we transport an evolved concept back in time, assuming that it existed in its evolved manifestation in every historical period, presume in this case, the ancient period. And what this involves, as far as IR theory is concerned, is that there is mining of history. There is a selective approach to history in only selecting cases and facts which sort of sit within, very comfortably within our theoretical postulates. This sense of the continuity claim then is based on this notion of tradition, in which texts play an integral role, texts like the Arthasastra. Because what texts help is to aid in writing history backwards. They help you construct that tradition, and there's a sense of finality and continuity which oral traditions lack because they are more ephemeral. The two strands that I talked about, which are from very different temporal scales, one which is the colonial period and the others the current literature on strategic culture, to which all of us are adding, including this debate we are having today, they of course exist in very different temporal scales, but there is one thing that they share in common, which is their orientation towards history. And like I said, there's a primacy that is given to the ancient period. And in doing so, the assumption is that there is a continuity that can be established between the ancient and the modern, that the key to understanding our current quandaries lie in perhaps unearthing some of the lost truths in the ancient period. And my attempt in this paper would be to locate our recent interest in the Arthashastra within this intellectual orientation. Now, as for the colonial intervention, I'm going to very briefly just touch upon both the colonial and the strategic culture literature. The colonial orientation began with the Orientalists and this whole strand or genre of writing called Indology, where the emphasis, like William Jones placed on text, because he believed that the text held the potential to lead back to the essence of Indian civilization or Hindu civilization that has been lost in this current state of depravity that was under the colonial rule. And this is also touching upon Nietzsche's understanding that something is pure at its birth or at its inception. And so texts were given more were considered to be representative of Hinduism over its living manifestation as a lived form in the Indian society. And James Mill, for instance, had said that what is worth seeing or hearing in India can easily be expressed in writing. So the two texts that were translated under the patronage of the British Empire were Manu's Dharma Shastra and the Gita, both in the 19th centuries. And although none of these are treatises by any long shot, the reason I'm mentioning these is that you see over a period of time the emphasis on text percolating into the nationalist movement as well, on trying to organize Indian culture and Hinduism, trying to locate and anchor it within certain texts. And the Gita's translation and Dharma Shastra's translation provided that much needed anchor for a religion as, within quotes, disorganized as Hinduism. Coming to contemporary interpretations, I mean, it's ironical that a country with rich strategic history like India should be so under-theorized and understudied within IR. But this is not to say that the interest that we have today in history is a recent development. The British Committee, which on IR, which began work in 1950s, was interested precisely in looking at the historical origins of the international system. And Adam Watson, who was a member of the British Committee, had said that he hailed the Arthasastra as a major analytical work in IR. And he said this is the first instance that a text is focusing so clearly with such conceptual clarity on the notion of neutrality. And then he goes on to say that it is curious that from the Arthashastra to the American Declaration of Independence, no other text puts the pursuit of happiness quite so high. The pursuit of happiness here being defined as security of the state. But more coming closer home in terms of how IR theory has dealt with strategic culture, particularly in terms of India's strategic culture, we see this uncritical acceptance of these colonial constructs that Indians are culturally programmed to be thinking short term, that they are culturally incapable of strategizing, that is reflected in a lot of not just Western scholarship on Indian strategic culture, but I must admit, unfortunately, even within Indian scholarship. And so one of the early studies in this was the Chicago Project in the 1950s, which was part of the area studies movement in the US. And Milton Singer, who was spearheading that, the attempt was to try and locate sacred centers, what can be seen to be quintessentially cultural about one particular country. And as far as India is concerned, the sacred center was placed within the Sanskritic tradition. And then you have in recent literature George Tanham talking about how Indians culturally are hardwired to believe in dharma and transmigration of soul. So to that extent, they are culturally very passive and fatalistic. So to take matters in their own hands and to be proactive is something that Indians are incapable of doing. The other end of the spectrum on strategic culture, people like Bharat Karnad, who would refer to Arthashastra and the Manusmriti to make the claim that Indians had a militaristic outlook strategically. But in taking a long view, and this is my third section, in taking a long view of these developments in scholarship, I would make a case for historicizing diplomacy. Now, in this, of course, there is no denying that ancient India had achieved a fair degree of political sophistication in the manner in which it conducted diplomacy or warfare. And we see that in the simultaneous interest that is there in two bodies of writing or genres of writing, that is the Dharma Shastra literature and the Arthashastra literature. The Dharma Shastra literature focused on the ethics of warfare, and that the ethics of warfare are bound integrally to the duties of the king, where the king is assumed to be an enlightened ruler, someone who's aware of the ethical dimensions of using violence or war. And he is enlightened because he is seen to be an extension of God. So in this framework of the Dharma Shastra literature, the emphasis was on karma yoga, where war is seen as a sacrificial act. Now, very distinct from this is the literature to which Kautliya's Arthasastra belongs to, which is the Arthasastra tradition itself, which focuses more on contractual kingship. War is not a sacrificial act, but instead it is one of the many means through which a king would achieve the security of the state, or as Adam Watson said, it's the pursuit of happiness. What were the implications of this on sovereignty? Now, both traditions had a very nebulous understanding of sovereignty, not as hidebound and territorially so closed as we imagine it today. And that is why it's necessary to historicize concepts like state or territory back in time, because you would also see that strategies that are employed to tackle sedition and warfare are very similar. So there's no dualistic understanding of force as I see it. In the sense that there is no distinction that is made on seeing internal violence as sedition and external force as war. And that is why there is an emphasis on expediency of use of force, that it should be used sparingly. I would try and locate also the king whom Kautliya is advising within a broader continuum of kingship. On who is actually the Hindu king as is assumed, because it should not be larger than life as we see it in the Arthasastra. The Hindu king is really the creation of the cosmic man or the Purusha. And to that extent, his divinity is inherent. It is not, it's not bestowed on him. And his kingdom likewise is a microcosm of the entire universe. That is why claims to be a Chakravartin or a universal domain are based precisely on this argument that his kingdom reflects all the elements that constitute the earth. This is very distinct from the Islamic tradition, where the king has a mere instrumental status, and he is vested by God. He's vested with divine attributes by God, but none of these creations or divine creations, such as the king, can actually be seen as faithful reflections of the God himself. So we can see that power is not understood in political terms; it's more in terms of ritual authority. And so the position of the Hindu king is very complex, because it's at once circumscribed and sacred, both. And so both genres of writing, that is the Dharma Shastra and the Arthashastra literature, emphasize on material and ideational aspects of power. You'd see Kautliya also emphasizing on symbolism, and points out to the it points out to the king that he should not be avoiding the fact that symbolism can be a potent tool for statecraft. To conclude, I would argue that there is a need to locate supposedly neutral concepts that we assume, such as power or statehood, that there is a need to locate them within specific historical and societal contexts. And to this, we can learn richly from this entire body of writing on the history of ideas that John Gunnell and Quentin Skinner have contributed in their conversations. And because history allows us to see culture in very dynamic terms. It exhorts us to problematize a lot of the concepts that we take for granted. Now, that's an exercise which is, of course, both powerful and disorienting, but I think it's nonetheless an exercise that we need to undertake, and also try and locate the Arthashastra and its postulates within the historical context in which it was written in, and rather than attributing contemporary meanings to it as some people tend to do. Thank you.